Here in the studio in London is the ODI's Executive Chair and co-founder Sir Nigel Shadbolt. Sir Nigel is joined by Irene Mawandwa, CEO of Policy, a feminist data and tech organisation in Nairobi, Kenya. And in New York, we have Rebecca Dissler, AI data and digital health strategist at the philanthropic organisation Foundation Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. Sir Nigel.
Thank you, Navdeep, and wonderful to have you both here, Irene and Rebecca. Well, look, it's been a very, very busy week or so. We had the Bletchley AI Summit, indeed the Bletchley Declaration we just talked about. When I look at this, there's a lot to be pleased about. Broad scope, emphasis on safety, talking about ethics, lots of talk of international collaboration and cooperation, a recognition of risks, a sense in which the Sustainable Development Goals and human rights are being foregrounded, and a talk of inclusive issues and the problem of the digital divide, and China was there. So I think there's a lot to be positive about, but of course there's been this ongoing worry that this was the very biggest tech platforms talking to a relatively small number of governments. And where's that diversity of voice? Decisions that affect many people should be talked about by many people. And I'd just like to give a sense, have a conversation about how we bring that about. But first of all, if I could perhaps turn to you, Rebecca. Very interestingly, the McGovern Foundation has announced it's going to be supporting work with the big tech platforms around AI safety. Tell us something about that and what the ambition and hope is and where you're going to be addressing safety issues.
Absolutely. Well, first, Nigel, thank you so much for inviting me to participate. What an honor to be in conversation with you and with Irene. I'd like to ground our participation in that AI Safety Fund in this really extraordinary moment that you just alluded to. This is an extraordinary moment in AI in terms of the rapid pace of technology, but also those policy milestones. As you had the AI Safety Summit in the UK and the Bletchley Declaration, you also had the US Executive Order on safe and secure trustworthy development and use of AI here in the United States, with 90 plus specific actions for nearly every agency across the US government. You also had last week the launch of the G7's voluntary principles and code of conduct for AI developers, as well as the OECD's report on country implementation of its AI ethical principles. So just a real extraordinary moment and set of conversations. But I think across all of these conversations, we're really observing kind of two dominant narratives, right? The first has been this focus on existential risk, right? Characterized by these threats to humanity like bioattacks or cybersecurity. And then oftentimes what we sort of view as a narrow focus on technical safety, right? The focus on the development and the deployment of the models themselves. And I think something we've observed and within our own work is those considerations of existential risk too often ignore some of the more immediate societal concerns like bias and very real harms that are well documented and researched. While let's say some of the more technocentric safety solutions often ignore the real lived experience of communities, right? Where safe and trustworthy go beyond the technology in a vacuum. I think, when Vice President Kamala Harris spoke at the AI Safety Summit last week, right? She talked about this existential risk of, when a woman is threatened by an abusive partner by deep fake photographs, right? That's an existential risk for her, right? Or if we can't discern, and I'm paraphrasing her speech right now, but if we can't discern kind of fact from fiction as, AI-enabled disinformation floods the internet, that could be an existential risk for democracy. Which is all to say that I think we think about AI safety in the context of the technical intervention, and we need to kind of spend some more time thinking about it in the context of a people intervention. And with that, it often feels like we're focused a bit on rather what could go wrong as opposed to what could go right if we were to design with intention. So just to share a little bit about our background as a foundation, the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, focused on advancing AI and data science for public good, we are really committed to sitting in that space, right? To bridging or investing in AI that bridges rather than widens the divides that we see in society today. So we support organizations that are working with communities, as we say often, at the front lines of vulnerabilities, right? Our portfolio is filled with organizations who envision and are creating a world made better through AI. We work with some civil society institutions that are, or are actually really building kind of new fit for purpose mechanisms to step into that technology and data conversation. And then, as you shared, we are beginning to do some of this intentional engagement with tech companies, but really with an eye to amplify civil society perspectives. And so, as you shared, our foundation recently joined the AI Safety Fund as an inaugural funder alongside OpenAI and Anthropic and Microsoft, Google, and others. It's a new $10 million fund to support independent researchers from around the world. And yes, part of this will be on developing and testing evaluation techniques for frontier models. But we're being really intentional in this engagement. And I think what we're seeing is a real commitment to this fund to articulate a robust and inclusive definition of what AI safety looks like. So yes, inclusive, let's say, for example, red teaming some of those direct risks, but also kind of expanding to consider the use of models within larger societal contexts. And our intention there is to amplify the concerns that civil society have been for a long time, I should say, raising awareness of, and ensure that they're given their due and important weight. And I'll name that this is not happening in a vacuum. It's a conversation we're elevating at all levels. The president of our foundation, Vilas Dar, was just appointed to the UN advisory body to advance recommendations around the international governance of AI. And it's grounded, it's connected in the sense that we need civil society in these spaces to redirect the focus to the immediate harms and immediate opportunities of these approaches.
Thank you very much. That's a really great framing, I think, of both the ambition of the McGovern Foundation, but also what you're trying to achieve. I mean, I think it's a super important point you've made, which is that these issues aren't entirely new. We've had AI in our lives. Perhaps we haven't always recognized it for some decades now, and in the decisions that are being taken, whether it's in facial biometrics or bank loans that are being given off the back of algorithmic decision making, these are similar pressing issues that impact people's lives here and now. And I think that the point you were making is that understanding people's lives here and now. I think the other thing that I noticed was that very often particular groups are particularly impacted by algorithmic decision making. When we talk about age appropriate design for children, or the particular challenges of using these technologies in vulnerable groups. And I think you're arguing for a much broader understanding of what the harms landscape looks like, and not just, as you say, technical harms. It's Alondra Harris, of course, who was involved, I think, in many of the ideas behind the Biden executive order, talks about thick alignment as opposed to just a technical consideration of whether the models are doing what we want them to do in a technical sense, but you're looking at a much broader set of values. So can I just, perhaps before I move on to Irene, talk about the issue of the challenge around the quality of data. We did observe that there was no explicit reference to the importance of data and data as infrastructure. And we use that term here in the ODI because we think that that speaks to the fact that data is foundational, that it needs to be of high quality, that it needs investing in, that we need to actually ensure it's interoperable, that it's as widely used as possible. What do we do to make sure that data isn't somehow bizarrely squeezed out of the conversation?
Well, thank you for that question. And in many ways, you've articulated a lot of of our own thinking and strategy, particularly in our digital health portfolio, which is the work that I lead. I think something that we've recognized, and Nigel, you've said this so clearly, right? There is no AI without data. And so for us, we recognize that it's not enough to invest in algorithms and models. We also need to focus on that enabling environment. And so for us, we look at investments in standards and interoperability, particularly in the health space, which is so fragmented, that's an investment that both improves quality of data and the data flow today, but also creates strong foundations for developing fit for purpose AI. So as one example, we've been pleased to partner with the World Health Organization, who's working to digitize through adoption of data standards, their clinical care guidelines and recommendations, which will make it easier to leverage digital platforms to deliver high quality care across member states. And then the other piece, and there's a focus on data. There's also a focus, or I think it needs to be a focus on cultures of data use, right? So there's the work that we can do and invest in the digital infrastructure, which, as you said, is such a critical enabler, but that data use is a really critical piece of it too. And so I'm thinking of the work, for example, of a partner like Nextleaf. It's a partner of ours. They develop sensors for vaccine fridges, for cold chain and delivery of immunizations. Their technology protects the vaccine supply chain for 1 in 10 babies born each year. And what they're doing is not just investing in the actual sensors themselves, but actually working hand in hand with ministries of health to understand how to interpret that data, how to analyze it, and then make decisions that can better protect vaccines. And that's such a critical part of it, because it's not just about encouraging high quality data. It's about ensuring that gets put into the hands of someone who knows what to do with it and is empowered to take the actions that we need to realize its impact.
Thank you very much. Perhaps at this stage I could bring Irene in, because you represent just such an important aspect of this conversation. You're working in communities, in contexts where very often the challenges are different in kind and scale. And perhaps you just talk a little bit about how you see all the excitement around the use of generative AI, but in the context within which you work, and what we need to be alert to whilst we try and make this technology really work in an inclusive and an effective way in different geographies, in different parts of the world.
Thank you very much to Rebecca and to ODI and to you, Sir Nigel, for inviting us to this wonderful summit. It's come full closure because we've been having conversations for a while now. And I'll just start off by highlighting, why is it so easy to abuse women online? And then when I pose this question to you and to the audience, is to also ask, why is it so easy for African women to experience more harms than any other person online? It's as easy as blinking. That's what some of our studies has shown, particularly for African women politicians. And some of the challenges that come with this are pertaining some of the development and advancement of technologies such as generative AI. With the advancement, we know that there needs to be lots of data sets. And with data sets, it means, there needs to be people who are able to translate some of these languages with which some of these data sets are being collected. But we know that the internet has at least 12 languages, or at least a 12 percentage point of languages that are fully online, making most of the languages spoken in Africa or African languages left out. When it comes to content moderation and large language models, they continue to exhibit a challenge that reduces or presents a very huge challenge for content moderation, especially for online abuse survivors. Therefore, it means that it'll take approximately 0 to 6 months to remove one abuse, whereas for an English speaker, it could take just a split second because the language is fully online. Those are some of the intricacies or challenges that I can speak of on behalf of African women that we've been able to see. The other bit is on the design of these AI technologies. We know considerably that most of these technologies are designed by a white man, and therefore even some experiences of white women and African women continue to lack. Data sets on issues such as periods, issues such as how to cook a meal, and how you just do a simple Google search are different because of who designed some of these technologies. So the advancement of these generative AI technologies really need to encompass our own experiences, and all this will be possible with advancements of policies on collection of gender data. Some of the work that we are getting into is compelling governments such as the Kenyan government to have necessary and very clear frameworks when it comes to collection of gender data to advance some of the goals that the new president has set out, such as the digital transformation, where he hopes to have finalized digitizing most of the government services by the end of next year. About 3,000 have been digitized so far, but we have been asking questions on, as you advance some of these technologies and services by the government, what is the role of AI and how do African women experience these technologies? So we are working with some civil society groups in Kenya to try and advance a framework that will support the nascent piece of work on gender data collection that will have the lived realities of African women and especially Kenyan women when it comes to getting a national ID. What does that entail as a Kenyan woman? And when you go online to access these e-government services and where you're receiving results or you're using generative AI to support you with some of these results, how will this come, or how will this come full closure or full circle to see the advancement of some of these services, and these services are able to reach African women and Kenyan women very fast. The last piece of information that I wanted to share, particularly on generative AI after design, is the space of African women and research and on generative AI. Very many young feminist organizations in the region, most actually are not formally registered or formally recognized, are advancing some of this work on gender data and generative AI in terms of how creatives and innovations have come of age, since our forefathers, since our grandparents. So we see there's a huge opportunity if some of these big tech companies set up their houses or their offices in the region so that they can receive first-hand feedback really from the region, so that they can also have some of our nuances as Africans into some of the new technologies that they're advancing. So we hope to see in the very near future ChatGPT having very many African languages. I see every day they have a new language on board. So I cannot wait to see my local languages such as Kimeru and Kikamba being some of the tools or languages that we're able to use on such a wonderful tool. That's what I can say for now, Nigel.
Thank you. And that just does remind me that whilst we are focusing on issues around safety, and the Safety Summit was very much on that, there is, as Rebecca said as well, huge opportunity for AI for good, and understanding those emancipatory and really extraordinary use cases. And I'd like to come back to some of those, but just also reflecting on the fact that there is a huge issue with the way in which technologies can be used to oppress and indeed disenfranchise, or indeed abuse or bully, or in other ways. And you talk about that in a very compelling way around just what happens when these flash mobs essentially are put together to pile in on particular individuals who are trying to make their voices heard. So that's clearly a worry we have in the generative AI, that this is a way of replicating a trolling ability. So, I think we have to take that very seriously. The idea, though, that we could think about benefits, that we could think about one of the challenges that people talk about often in AI is so-called model collapse, that the AIs will start to generate so much of their own content that they kind of revert to some very bland mean. And what I heard in your wonderful work there was the sense that there's a diversity of voice and a huge potential for new content to be contributed from the African continent, and I'm sure from the global South in general. Can you tell a little bit more about how we could make that happen? You talk about the tech companies setting up and taking more partnerships with communities. What would you like to see?
Oh, definitely, Sir Nigel. Some of the quick results is some of the work that has begun in the region, with many African governments setting up frameworks and policies and laws on digital transformation and data governance. What we feel deep in our heart is probably missing is that civic engagement and public participation that uses simple language to just advance these conversations. As is, some of the language around generative AI is quite advanced. There's a bit of jargon that keeps, disenfranchising and bringing about a huge gap and literacy disparities between the government, the technology community, and civil society workers like ourselves and the general public. So some of the work we were hoping is that in some of the education curricular reviews that's happening yearly and regularly by governments is to see how they can simplify some of these technologies and include in the education curriculums. The other set of work is to see how they can even have this in local languages. So is to look for the word on AI in Swahili, in my mother tongue, to see how this can be communicated to the huge youth population in Africa, which is over 70%, and most of them use local language again. So those are some the sets of work that we feel can bridge the gap with, again, the government trusting the youth and trusting local communities to lead the process, because they'll be able to advance. Same case, some of the innovations we know our grandmothers and our ancestors were able to lead from way back. We know there's an opportunity for the same to happen even in the wake of tech advancements.
And that is one of the great surprises to many who have worked in the field of AI, as I have for 40 years. I started up in computational linguistics, and back then we thought that the secret to language translation was hard work around recording dictionaries, putting explicit rules of the language into these systems, and then having enough content to train and inform them. The remarkable fact is that with these deep models, that because they have a good understanding of quite a broad range of models, they can use that deep structural understanding to generalize to languages that are very poorly represented. So I think that's why we're seeing this explosion of much less represented languages being brought into this potential world of AI. And that is very exciting for me too. Rebecca, if I could come back for you just to ask, you've heard kind of Irene's kind of sense of the challenge in her own kind of context, but back in the US and also in the UK, in many democracies that we're looking at, there's this great fear that we're looking at elections coming up where the potential for misinformation, for social and political harms because of the use of AI generative model technology is something that's really concerning people. How do we respond to that, and what might we do in a data context to tame that? And one thing that's been very powerfully articulated in the Biden executive order is the idea of watermarking, that you should carry the provenance of where data or information is coming from right on the front of the information distributed. You know, we have this principle, my colleague and I talk about this, Roger Hampson and I, when we wrote the Digital 8 book, we talked about a thing being what it is, saying what it is and being what it says. You know, that there's an authenticity we want out of these systems, that not we're being kind of corralled and driven into particular polarized positions. What do we do about that challenge?
Well, thank you so much for the question. And if I may, I'd like to try to answer some of it, but also bring it back to I think some of the points that Irene shared, and through my own work and expertise in health, which is the lens through which I enter this conversation. To your point about what we do about this, I'll just name a lot of what you've shared is not a new challenge, right? When we've talked about content moderation, when we've talked about misinformation, this has been a challenge on many of these platforms for years. And so I think there is a common refrain here that when we were talking about, back to these conversations about AI safety around the sort of what do we do about it, we have some of the tools in the toolkit. And unfortunately, I don't think we are using as many of them as I think we best can. On the specific watermarks and the AI labels, you know, something I always I look to in the health space, right, which I think has done there's been a lot of really interesting leadership on this, are things like the nutrition labels, right, for models, right? And so a real understanding of your data provenance and where these come from. I do think that's important. I want to pick up on what Irene shared, where there is both sort of the work that these organizations and these platforms need to do, but there's also a real need to increase, I think, awareness and AI literacy amongst the general population. It's a both, I think, right? We need sort of the stronger sort of regulation and policy landscape that is going to support some of this, but then also focus on the sort of the general population. And so, for example, within our workforce and education pillar, a lot of what we focus on are not just sort of the traditional STEM, but actually working with organizations like quill.org that are trying to complement these concepts with broader AI awareness, right? That are thinking about how do we train folks on understanding how AI is present in our lives today. How does it use information to make predictions? Where might it have bias? And I think these are concepts that have deep resonance for all students and could be adopted in a variety of areas. But if we have a moment, I'd love to come back to the health and data question.
No, we'll do that. We'll do that. I mean, I just back to you, Irene. I mean, I think that's a great point that was made. And you made the really important point that we often talk, one of the pillars of our work here in the Open Data Institute is data literacy. And that now extends out, I think, importantly, to an understanding and an appreciation of AI literacy. This doesn't mean that everybody has to understand the depths of the algorithms, but some awareness of what the strengths and weaknesses of these systems are, in the same way we've learned to use power tools in our daily life, from spreadsheets to databases. Those tools are going to be infused with generative AI, I think it's pretty important that we get some sense of what is behind that advice and guidance. How would you like to see literacy working in your context? What could we do? Is this about more courseware? Is it about more peer support learning? What are the programs that you've seen that work here?
So certainly some of the suggestions you make, Nigel, would make sense. Remember, these advancements sometimes are ahead of some of the plans that even African governments have. So it's a matter of testing and being really open-minded and giving it an opportunity to have an impact. So some of the work that we've seen definitely are on peer-to-peer engagement, where research organizations like yourself and ourselves collaborate to bring in new research that can advance some of the plans that governments have. The other piece definitely is borrowing from different communities to see if it worked in your community, how can we custom make this to make sure that it works in our communities. And some examples, I know that in some pieces of work happening, there's going to be a cities exchange meeting at the end of the month where local councillors from all over the world are going to be exchanging ideas, and this will fall and give an opportunity for e-government services to have a discussion and to see how they can also advance these technologies in their localities. So peer-to-peer exchange, local community engagement is an opportunity. Curriculum reviews every now and then so that you can stay ahead of the technology advancement conversations, with Africa governments also sitting together in the regional blocks in our instance to really see how they can shape the region's laws and frameworks, and also see how they can ratify some of the existing policy frameworks that have also been put in place to better these conversations on technologies and data. And a case example is the Africa Union Data Policy Framework, which was set out recently, and very many African governments have taken up and have really started the advancement and the work around that.
Thank you. And then I think we have to give a little bit of time to your passion then, Rebecca, around the huge potential for AI and the data that fuels it to impact health and health outcomes and the kind of research we can do. So say something about that space and why you're particularly excited by it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And in some ways, it's very much, I think it's very much tied to a lot of the themes that Irene has been saying. And I really want to amplify what she's saying about community engagement, about lived experience, and having that being reflected in the data. I think, as we've said throughout this conversation, right, there is no AI without data. And I think health is a perfect example of where you have tremendous opportunity. There's 30% of the world's data is generated by the healthcare industry. Yet because of some of these challenges of that data fragmentation, the digital infrastructure, we are not using it to its full potential. But I want to name sort of two things. The first is the importance of understanding the communities in which we deploy AI and how that's so critical to getting the data and the digital systems right. I'm reminded and wanted to share this example when Irene was talking about, there was an AI model that, as an example, was deployed here in the hospitals in the United States that was meant to flag high-risk patients, right? And once they were selected, they were going to receive additional care resources, right? And the entire aim of this was to reduce the costs of complex care. And so to make the prediction, the model relied on data about how much it cost to treat a patient. But when it was deployed, a review of that model found that it was recommending white patients at a disproportionately higher rate than Black patients. And this was because in the data, Black people did not incur as much cost in our health systems. And that's not necessarily because they're healthier, right? But because they didn't have as much access. They receive less care than white patients for the same disease burden, and therefore account for less medical spending on average. And so they're misrepresented in the data. And when corrected, it would more than double the number of Black patients flagged for additional care. So that really underscores the importance of understanding the communities in which we deploy AI and the ways in which people experience healthcare. And I think that can be extrapolated to say that I think it's time we all collectively realize that we have skin in this game. You know, that executive order that we've talked about has 90s plus, I think, specific actions for agencies across every government, right? And I think, Sir Nigel, you've said in your own work that the reality is that folks will not necessarily be writing code, but they still have to be able to understand the technologies they work with and how it impacts their lives. And so I think that's why we need more voices at the table. And this is where that engagement with civil society comes in. And when we can support
That's why
civil society.
It's been wonderful to have your contributions here, because I think that you really brought it back to a fundamental challenge for us, which is the diversity and quality of the data that's informing our algorithms, that's informing our models. And whilst people are talking about the dangers of model collapse, literally a reversion to the mean, because a lot of the data will be generated synthetically by these models, the data that is out there needs to be the data that properly represents all of our populations, all of our demographies. So perhaps, Irene, just to give you a final word on this, in collecting that data, that's an ongoing and an existing challenge that the ODI has been very aware of, how we make investments to get high quality data from the places that need to be better represented. You've suggested some of the mechanisms. How do we get that message clearly over to the tech titans to understand that it will be in their interest to have a broader and more diverse data ecosystem?
Thank you again. So at policy level, we will continue leading on the research, especially that centers African women. The latest piece of work on this was our visions of Afrofeminist emancipatory liberatory AI, which was a framework, and I'm inviting all of us to really go through that has ideas of commitments to eradicate all forms of oppression towards African women that are aided by AI. This framework, of course, we hope that African governments and governance structures are able to correct some of the mistakes that happened in the past, the historical exclusion of African women from different processes. We don't want to see a repeat in the AI discourse, and it will guide, again, the big tech community to critically think about how African women and marginalized groups come into these AI conversations. The other piece of work that I would make recommendation again on is heavy investment on STEM courses and hiring of Africa-based STEM experts, because they'll be able to bring in, again, their own personal and lived experiences, which will correct some of these historical misgivings that have already started to come out into some of this generative AI that we're using to date. So centering Africans in the process of the design and in the process of laying it out and usage is really some of the key ways to advance better and public good usage of AI.
Thank you so much. Look, the time has just raced by. It's been the most fantastic and energizing conversation. You've touched on so many things, the quality of data, the fact that it needs to be diverse, the fact that we probably need new ways and methods, institutions, and indeed conventions for pulling that data together, ensuring that everybody's voice is represented. Can I just thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Irene, for a wonderful set of contributions, and just making me reflect on the fact that there is no AI for good without good AI data. And that really has come through extraordinarily strongly in your presentations and in our conversation here today. Thank you so much for all that you do. I look forward to working with you in the future. From the ODI, thank you, and over to Matthew.